Hello and welcome! Today is a bit of a bittersweet day for me as I've had to say goodbye and take down my games from the Android and iOS app stores. Well over 10 years ago, I started my adventures into amateur game development and made 8 full games which were available until August 1st of 2025. Ranging from fun tech demos to games which I've supported right up until the end. So join me as I take a look back at those games and, well, let me give you a bit of a timeline and why I decided to make them. The hardest thing that I remember about getting into game development was just finding the right engine to use for me. Up to this point, I've been making my ideas for games in the restrictive Little Big Planet creation environment. So moving over from that to a proper game engine wasn't necessarily the easiest thing for me to do. For years, I tried to teach myself coding and Android development, and for game development, I even tried my hand at Game Maker. But due to the frustrations of the former and the inaccuracies of the latter, I didn't feel comfortable with game design until I taught myself how to use the Unity game engine. My first game in Unity was Tennis for One, released in October of 2014. It was a great learning tool for me to how to make a game with basic movements, collision detection, and everything that you would need to make a proper game and even publish it on Android. The code was and is simple, but the results were, at least in my view, fun. I later refined my skills while in school and even taught myself how to use Blender enough to make a 3D game for a class that I was taking. I called it Hover Maze, and again my brother took it and released it in August of 2015. Hover Maze is important because it taught me something very powerful. How to code in another language that wasn't Java or JavaScript. In fact, I still think C# is probably one of my favorite languages to this day. But it wouldn't be until Space's Not Invading, released in October of 2015, when I started taking this game design seriously. Around this time, I really wanted to play mobile games since it was getting rather popular. But I couldn't find games which I found interesting. So instead of complaining, I decided to just make my own. With what I learned while making Tennis for One and Hover Maze, I wanted to focus on making a good feeling game, which could be played with a single hand. This led me to my control code, which has been used in practically every game that I have made afterwards. With the basics controls sorted, I started playing with some of the game modes, adding more features and trying out some different game designs. The ultimate goal was to turn it into a game collection of sorts, but after getting bored of the idea, I just gave it to my brother to release it again on Google Play and turned my attention to a much bigger project that popped into my head. This bigger project turned into my most popular game that I ever made, Robotipede, released in December of 2015. While developing Space's Not Invading, I felt that a touchscreen would work best with a trackball control. And the first game which came to mind which would be perfect to test the idea would be a game like Centipede. Learning to develop my own game on top wasn't easy. Everything about the game had to be rethought to get it to work well with touch controls. From how to get the game object to move following, as well as to get the ship to move and to shoot in just the right way so it felt intuitive. A big change which I made into Robotipede over time was actually moving away from the traditional trackball and button control scheme which I originally set out with, and moving to an auto-fire system which most space shooters on phones were leading heavily towards. While I prefer the original control schemes, a lot of the people that I gave the game to highly suggested to keep the auto fire as default. So I compromised like everything, and I just added the original controls as a toggle on the main menu. Due to its popularity, I've always kept Robotipede up to date over the years, even going so far as doing extensive code cleanups and updates as I improved my skills and added more advanced code and features into my other titles. Robotipede was the first game that I had ads in it, with the idea that one play was one full screen ad, like putting a quarter into the arcade machine, as well as one of the first games with in-app purchases, being able to just disable the ads and just play the game as is. And with the success of Robotipede, I looked for other trackball games that I just wanted to try my hand at making. I consider games like Crystal Castle to other shooters like Missile Command. But that year, my brother got his hands on a new PlayStation 1 game called Namco Museum Volume 5, and he got obsessed with ElectroCross. I don't know what about that game made me think that it would work well as a trackball game, but hey, if it looked like it would work, why not? So I went ahead and tried it out, and in May of 2016, I released ElectroCross. This would be the first time I actually went through the full development process from start to end. I was the one that published ElectroCross. This is also the first traditional game that I made in Unity, with levels and a bit of a progression system. Music was made by my grandmother, who played it on her MIDI piano, and I mixed it to sound a little bit retro. The game itself is fun, but never was as popular as Robotipede. We tried doing a lot of things to see what we could do to promote and get it some attention, like using some free credits on Google Ads to advertise the game as well, or even paying Google or someone at Google to translate it into another language. But we had no luck in replicating the success of Robotipede, which kind of became an obsession of mine. I just had one quick little detour to finish up first. You see, there was this little tiny bug in the older builds of Robotipede which really got under my skin. Shots would sometimes go through the enemies. I was really annoyed with this and decided to fix this myself. And hey, while I'm at it, why not turn these tech demos into just simple little games? The first is the Breakout-inspired Super Blockout, released in July of 2016. Then Invaders from Space, released in August of 2016. The code behind this was very interesting, but Invaders of Space was the unsung hero here. It was both a practical implementation of my new collision code, as well as an experiment for how to make these games both look and play beautifully. And Invaders from Space turned into a little success story, showing me that if I make the right game with the right elements in it, I can have some success in my game making endeavors. So after I took the new code back into Robotipede, I was looking for the next title, that next success for my next game. I really wanted to do something bigger and better. I kind of wanted to make a real game that could be, let's say, put onto a console, which would eventually be called Robots of Rage, released in September of 2016. This was my first game with something that resembled a story, my first game with multiple enemy AIs and bosses. It was a short game, but I felt it had some charm. Unfortunately, Robots of Rage had issues, and I feel it stemmed from the marred development that we had, especially after some ad partners started working with us. A lot of our conversations in consulting was about trying to add pauses and breaks, which would naturally lead to ads and interstitials that we could inject in there. For us, we wanted to make this as sustainable as possible, so the prospect of more money was good. We even moved over to their ad platforms. but it really didn't help the development of Robots in Rage. By the time the game came out, I wasn't really happy with it. I did what I could to balance showing ads with not interrupting the game, which eventually I would roll back to a more reasonable state. But even then, I did consider the game to be incomplete. But looking at it now, I really don't know what I could have added to make it a better game. I feel this game lasts about as long as my interest usually does with these kinds of games, so maybe that had something to do with it too. Though at the time, my mind raced instantly to the controls. I went a little more traditional with this game. So for my next title, I decided to go back to basics and try out a new idea for a control scheme that I thought of. This was another experiment turned into another app called Tap Berserk, or as it was originally called when it was released in October of 2016, New Berserk. I wanted to make a proper controlling game, which was designed from the ground up to work perfectly with touchscreens. Touchscreens aren't really designed to work well with traditional controls. It works well with taps and holds, so I centered the entire game around that concept and used basic AI, pathfinding and all that good stuff for the game to actually play out itself. The results were interesting. Tap Berserk turned out well by my books, proper arcade difficulty, but you had to get past the slightly unconventional controls to enjoy it, and a lot of the feedback that I got from it suggested that the controls were a sticking point to players. But enough people enjoyed it that I did consider it to be a successful game for my standards. It was also around this time that all of my games collectively were making enough that I was considering trying to get into this game design thing myself full time. But Tap Berserk would be my last successful project, as afterwards both my studies and what I wanted to do with games would both grow. This got me thinking of new ways to control games on phone screens. And after being roped into a marketing exercise from a local college, on February 2017, I released Dodgedom. The game allowed for a side panel which had your controls with a game view that had the action. It was a forgettable, even by myself, title, and it led me into some interesting things, but ultimately the game didn't really do that well. I was getting more and more obsessed with breaking the code for how to make touchscreens work as a controller, and I decided to finish it off once and for all that year. I tested it first in my spring of 2017 Android class as its final project with controller test, which I eventually remade into Unity. I really wanted to test this controller with a game which would traditionally be difficult to play on a touch screen. The game which I eventually settled on was Donkey Kong, and I reworked it to be as legally distinct as I could while working on doing everything I could to make sure that it would work on phones. Color borders to indicate movement, digging into native code to activate vibration motors, and even to add a dynamic viewport which would let the game work on any screen in any orientation. It was technically a beautiful game, but releasing it was such a pain that I don't want to ever go through that again. The fear that companies have regarding Nintendo and potential lawsuits is genuinely terrifying, and it most likely is for good reason. Apple flat out refused to publish the title on their store, while Google would eventually relent and let me release it on June of 2017. But it had to be stripped out of practically every single ad except banners, which actually let me put it as a kid-friendly label on the app. But man, Kid Kong's release was a mess, but the controls did the job that they were supposed to do. In my view, this was the best playing platformer on mobile. The game may have only just been okay, but that was more my skill as a designer and less of the controls. That said, even with the best controls on mobile implied, it still paled in comparison to just using an actual controller. The lesson I learned after doing all this work, trying my best to nail down controllers which works well on a phone, is that a mobile phone screen just can't play traditional games, at least without a real controller, since glass is just a terrible input method, since it has no way to give the player any meaningful feedback. After Kid Kong, I went on to finish my studies at university, graduating in 2018. Then, with the permission of my wife, at the time girlfriend, I went on a few-month crusade to try to make one more new game. It was going well until I had a brilliant idea. Why not make it with multiplayer? You know, use the built-in radios that exist in all phones, let it pair together and play with friends, just like a Nintendo DS. I mean, the idea is not bad, and it morphed and changed and actually was working well on Android. However, I was both running out of time, money, and my wife's patience, and by the end of development, I hit a massive roadblock known as Apple's broken implementation of the Bluetooth standard. I had to scrap months of work, R&D, and when I finally got to finish the game, it resulted in August of 2018's She's Out There. It wasn't a very good game, but it was a fun and simple one. It's honestly my best attempt at making a game that's able to adapt to various screen sizes to date. In fact, I'm very pleased with how that worked. I'm also pleased with the collaboration I did. My sister helped me with the artwork, and before I went on the multiplayer binge, so was my wife helping me refine the gameplay idea. But while She's Out There wasn't the success I was hoping for, it wasn't the reason why I stopped making games after 2018. The reason I stopped making games is sadly simple. My games just weren't making the money that they used to. At the beginning, they were making a shocking amount of money considering the amount of effort I put into it. Then the value of the ads just kept dropping and going down more and more and diminishing. Even if She's Out There was a massive success, the value which people put into mobile games just wasn't enough to just justify spending my full time on it. And while we had some sales selling the gold editions of the game, it wasn't the same as we were getting with ads, even at their diminished value. However, it was making enough to justify their own existence on the app stores. So I just kept things going until Google or Apple changed their requirements and made the game obsolete. I was thinking that it would be something like the transition between 32-bit iOS to 64-bit iOS that would kill my apps. However, when I got a baseless cease and desist letter for trademark infringements, that kind of killed the whole thing. Well, I could entertain the idea and actually fight for this. With the amount of money that these apps are actually making, it's just not worth the hassle to go and fight this in court. Plus, my focus and my interests have moved on. I've absolutely fallen in love with CAD designs and making 3D printable things to sell on eBay and Etsy, as well as making videos talking about games, especially with the knowledge that I have with how to actually make them. I would love to make some new games in the future. I do even have some ideas that I want to expand upon. But these aren't the 1 or 2 month experiment projects that I was doing before. These will be taking years of my life to actually develop and make, let alone refine to the point where somebody can understand my rambling. I am hopeful, though, that one day I will find the time where I can start making games again. But until then, thank you ever so much for watching and listening to me ramble about these old games. I hope you have yourself a good day, and as always, take care.